What's going on, guys? In today's video, we're going to be recreating Stripe's hero using Next.js and Spline 3D. Before I get right into the build, I'm going to explain exactly how we're going to do this. So I've got Figma opened up. This is what the mockup I created looks like based off what currently exists on Stripe's website. And if I scroll to the right, here are a list of the steps we're going to follow in order to create the build. So the first part of the video, we're going to create the background itself, and this will be done using Spline 3D. Once we've done this, we're then going to open up VScode and install Next.js and Spline 3D from npm so that we can start building out our final design. The third step is we're going to start defining the theme styles so that we have an understanding of what it will look like. And finally, the final step, which is actually building out the components themselves. So if I scroll to the right again over here, for this tutorial, we have 5 different components that we'll be creating. The first one will be our background, which, like what I said before, will be done using Spline 3D. The second one will be our navigation bar. Our third one will be our title that has this really cool overlay effect. Our fourth one will be our button. And finally, our contents will be our final component. And with all these components combined, we will then have created our final design, which is the Stripe hero. I should also mention, if you would like to get access to the original files, I do have a link in the description, which will take you to my GitHub repository. And from here, you're more than welcome to download or copy the entire project yourself. That way you have access to all of the image assets, all of the components themselves, and you're more than welcome to use that as a guideline. Once you have an understanding of how this works and what we're going to do, we're now going to jump into the first step, which will be opening up Spline 3D and creating the background animation. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Great, so I have Spline 3D opened up, and the first thing we want to do is to add a sphere to the canvas. So in order to do this, what you want to do is click on this sphere icon here, and then from here we want to drag this out like so. And we want to place this roughly in the center. That looks quite good. From here, what we want to do is we want to grab the side here, drag this out so it starts to look like this. I'm going to quickly bring this out to the center slightly. Once your sphere is starting to look like this, the next step is I'm going to click on the sphere itself and apply a material that I created earlier on. So I'm going to add in our rainbow effect here. To get a better understanding of how I've created this, if we actually click on the material itself, it consists of 2 layers. So the first layer is our displace layer. So we've set the settings here to simplex for the type, the scale set to 5, the movement set to 200, and the offset set to 0, 0, and 0. And in terms of the actual color that we created here, if we click on depth, so the mode is set to color, our origin is set to vector, our blending is set to smooth. We have 5 different colors that this layer is using. So we have a purple that uses the hex code 9A00DD. We have an orange that uses F3B250. We have a green that uses CEDB24. We have this nice blue color that uses 6CD6F5. And finally, we have a purple that uses the exact same one as the first one. And if we scroll down here, and actually get out of this color here, we have a couple of other settings that I've created for us here. So the type here, we want to make sure this is set to linear. We also want to ensure that the direction here is set to 1 for the X and 0.54 for the Z direction. For our near value, we want to make sure this is set to -140. And for our far value, make sure it's set to 200. So once you've done that, and what you can do as well, if you want to start to create this effect, you can start to manipulate the depth if you want, like so, by moving these arrows here. And once you're quite satisfied with how this looks, you can also change the size of it, but just try and get it to something that looks roughly like this. So once your shape is starting to look like this and you're quite satisfied with the way it looks, the next step is we want to start creating that cool animation effect. In order to do that, what you want to do is click on your sphere object that we created. From here, we can go into states. So click on this plus button here, and it should have created 2 different states. We have a base state, which represents what it's going to look like before, and we have a regular state, which is what represents and shows what it's going to look like afterwards. So for the regular state, what we can do now is go into our displace icon here, and we can set the movement to something like 225. And to make sure this is working, if we toggle between the two, we should see this difference. That means it's working, and that's starting to look quite good. Once you've done that, another thing that we can do is with the depth, we can start to manipulate some of the colors and make it look like it's moving. So what we can do is change the origin values here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to manipulate something like the X value and perhaps bring it out like so. That looks quite cool. And if we toggle between the two, we should have a completely different looking shape like what we have here. That looks quite good. So once you've defined your base state and the regular state, the next step is to actually create the transition. So in order to do that, what you want to do is come over to the events icon here, click on the plus here. What we want to do is click on transition. And once you've clicked on transition, what we want to do is set this value here to something like 15. So this means it gives us 15 seconds for the base state to change into the regular state. In addition, we want to make sure this animation lasts forever. So in order to do that, what you want to do is come over to loop, change this value to infinite. And for the cycle, we want to set it to ping pong, so it goes backwards and forwards. And to make sure this is working properly, what we can do is zoom in until we're quite satisfied with roughly where we want the animation to occur. And if we click on play, we have this really cool looking animation, and that's starting to look really, really cool. Once you're satisfied with how that's looking, we can exit out of there. So the next step of this video is we want to create a background that will be behind this object here. So what we can do now is duplicate the sphere that we just created. And I'm just going to bring this out here. And what we can do now is we can actually scale this up. So I'm just going to do that right now. Scale it up to a value that you're quite happy with. In fact, I'm just going to bring this out like so. Just start to play around with it until you're quite happy with how it looks. Maybe bring that in slightly more. And in order to get the colors to blend in with our current sphere in front, what we can do is in the base state, if we go into our depth here, we can start to play with the arrows here so that it starts to line up with the colors here. And what we can do is bring this in like so, so it starts to slowly blend in with the sphere out the front that we just created. I might bring this in a tad, or maybe bring this out slightly more. But since we don't want it to completely blend in, I'm going to start manipulating some of these positions like so. And if we zoom in, we have this really cool line occurring here. That's starting to look really cool. All right, that looks quite good. And what I might do is zoom in again, hit play and see how that looks. That's starting to look really, really cool. Although I feel like this line is too clear for us. So in order to fix that up, I'm just going to go straight back into our depth here. I'm going to keep manipulating this until I'm quite happy with how it looks. Maybe bring this out slightly more. Yep. And what we can do now is zoom directly into exactly where we want the animation to occur. If we hit on play, this is what it's starting to look like. Our colors are starting to change, which is really, really cool. In fact, I actually might bring this down a bit. Yep, that's starting to look quite cool. One final step that we can actually start to do, I'm going to create a personal camera just so I can move around freely. What we can do now is we can actually start to compress the sizes of the actual animation once we're quite happy with how it looks. In order to do this, what we can do is click on one of the spheres that we created. In this case, I'm going to click on the first one. And from here, what you want to do is click on smooth and edit, and make sure that the subdivision modifier is set to 1 or 2, just depending on how fast you want it to load. I'm happy with 1 in this instance. And for the second one, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Click on smooth and edit. And by doing so, that should help improve the load speeds. Another thing you can also do is if you click on export, and if we go into the code export tab and hit on run tests, what this will do is it will optimize the screen for us so that the load time is much faster than how it would be without running this test. So this is looking quite good. It has a loading speed of 99 out of 100, and it's condensed the file size for us. So that should help load the scene into our Next.js application once we start building it out. And what we can do now is swap it back to camera, which is what the actual scene started off with. And once you're quite happy with how the animation looks and the way everything's going, the next step we want to do is click on export. And from here, what we can actually do is go into our play settings here under the code export tab. And from here, what we want to do is make sure that the orbit, pan, zoom, and soft orbit are set to no. This just ensures that the user can't actually manipulate and change the viewport of how this is currently looking. Once you've optimized the scene and you're quite happy with how the animation is looking, in this case, I'm very happy with how it looks here. The next step we can do is click on export. And from here, what we can do is we can go into the tab up here. And what we're going to do is make sure to select React. And this gives us the line of code that we'll be using and implementing into our own application so that we can use this as our background. Once you're happy with that, all you have to do is click on Update Code Export. And that's it. So that's the end of the Spline 3D animation. The next step is we're going to start importing this scene into our Next.js application. But first, we're going to be installing Next.js as well as Spline from NPM so that we can start to manipulate and create the application from scratch. So without further ado, let's get into that step right now. So I've got VScode open, and the very first thing we want to do is to install Next.js. In order to do this, make sure you have Node installed so that we can actually install stuff using Node Package Manager. And we're going to do that right now. So what we want to do is go into your terminal here. And what we want to do is we want to type in the following: npx create next app. And we also want to give it a title. In this case, I'm going to call it Stripe Hero. Hit enter. What should happen is we should be given a bunch of prompts. For TypeScript, we're going to go yes, no, no, yes, yes, and no. After doing so, it should install all the Next.js files for us. Fantastic. So it appears that it installed successfully. Once you've installed it, the next step is we want to get inside of this folder. And in order to do that, all you have to do is type in CD and then type in whatever you called the folder. In this case, it's called Stripe Hero. Hit enter. So now we are inside of the Stripe Hero folder. Fantastic. Once you're inside of the actual Next.js folder, in this case, it's Stripe Hero. The next part of the video is we want to install 2 packages, which enables us to bring in our Spline 3D creation into Next.js. In order for that to work, the first package we want to type in is this one. So it's npm install @splinetool/react spline. So hit enter. Once that's been installed, the second one that we also want to run and put in is something called npm install @splinetool/runtime. Hit enter. So once you've installed all the packages and you've got Next.js up and running, to make sure it's working properly, we want to start a server. So in order to do that, what you want to do is type in npm run dev, hit enter. And what should happen, you should get this message and it's created a server for us. So what we're going to do now is go to localhost 3000 to make sure it's working. Fantastic. So I've just loaded up localhost 3000 on my browser. This is what it's looking like. And if you see a page similar to this, it means you've installed the Next.js package successfully, and we can now get into the next step. So what we want to do now is we want to start importing some of the images that I created. So things like our logo file, as well as some arrows like so. If you'd like to get access to these images, I'll provide a link in the description, which will take you to the GitHub repository. So make sure to go on the GitHub repository in order to get access to the images themselves. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to drag the images that I created onto and inside of the public folder like so. So inside of here, we have a bunch of images. So we have a white arrow, we have a black arrow, we have the actual logo, and we also have the hero image like so. So yes, please make sure to go on the GitHub repository if you wish to get access to this folder. And that way you can follow along with the video. Great. So once you have your images inside of the public folder and everything's working perfectly, we can now start to style the actual theme itself. So once you've imported the images folder, the next step is we want to start styling the actual theme. And before we actually style it, what you want to do is go into page.tsx. And everything within the parent div we want to delete. So let's do that right now. I'm just going to delete all of this. I'm also going to delete the image up here. And if we go back into our project, it should be a blank screen like so. This means it's working perfectly. And I'm just going to quickly go back into VS Code. Once it's looking like a blank screen, we can now go directly into the globals.css style. And you'll notice there's a whole bunch of styling here. Just ignore all of this and come down to where it says the body here. And what we want to do is actually to delete this completely. And what should happen now is we should have a white screen, which we do. That's looking good. And once you've done that, what we want to do now is we want to define two styles. The first one is going to be our H1 and the second one is going to be our P tag. So let's do that right now. For our H1, I'm just going to go directly into our Spline 3D. I'm going to click on here. And I've already defined the styles for us thanks to the dev mode with Figma. So I'm just going to copy this. You're more than welcome to copy the styles here. Go into our globals.css file, save that. I'm going to get rid of inter. And after doing that, since I want this style to be responsive, I'm going to change the font size to a clamp value of 54 pixels as the lowest value and 94 pixels as the maximum value with a range of 7 vertical width. In addition, I'm also going to define the line height to have a clamp as well so that it's responsive depending on the screen size. In this case, I'm going to set the clamp with a low value of 4 rem in between 6.5 vertical width as the range, as well as 6.11 rem for the maximum. And I'm just going to quickly save that. After doing that, I'm going to define our P tag. So if we go back into our Figma design, we click on our P tag, it will give us a whole bunch of styles here. So I'm just going to copy this, go back into our globals.css file, save this, and get rid of the font family. And with this instance, I'm just going to leave it as is. And to make sure these styles are working correctly, I'm going to go into our page.tsx file. I'm going to create a h1 tag and call it this is a heading. And our p tag, this is a description. Just to make sure that the styles look similar to how it does in our Figma prototype here, I'm going to go directly into the design itself. And this is what it's starting to look like. So we have our H1, which is looking really good. And we also have our P tag, which is looking fantastic. You may notice everything is centered and I want everything to be a blanket slate. So in order to fix this, what we can do now is go back into our VS Code. What we can do is go into our page.module.css file. Everything underneath the main div, we want to delete, save that. And for our page here, what we want to do is set the width to something like 100 vertical width. So it spans the entire viewport as well as the height to 100%. We also want to set the position to something like relative. And we also want to set the top position to 0, like so. That's starting to look good. And to make sure that's working perfectly, I'm just going to quickly go back into here and everything should be aligned directly to the top left. If your design is starting to look like this, you've done everything correctly. And we can now move on to the next step, which will be defining the actual components. What we want to do now is inside of our source folder here, we want to create a new folder and call it components. Inside the components folder, the first component we're going to be working on is the background animation, which is shown in the Figma prototype here. So let's do that right now. We want to create a new folder and call it background. Inside of background, we want to create two different file types. The first one will be our page structure, and this will be called background.tsx. The second file we want to put in is the actual styles. So we want to create a CSS file called background.module.css, like so. After doing so, once we have created those files, go inside of background.tsx and type in IAFCE. It should give us this template for the component. Once you've done that, the next thing we want to do is to import the styles so we can start to manipulate how the canvas looks. So what we're going to do is type in import styles from background.module.css. So we're targeting this file here. After doing that, and once you've created your two files, what you want to do is go into your Spline file that we just created. And what you want to do is copy this line of code here, which can be found under the code export tab. I'm just going to quickly go back into VS Code. I'm going to paste it underneath here. And what we want to do as well is we want to grab this line here, import Spline from @spline-tool/React Spline. Let's paste that in there. In addition, we also want to grab this line of code here and we want to paste it directly into here. Save that. We want to delete that, save it. And once you've done that, the next step that we want to do is we want to define the class name for this spline scene that we just created. So in this instance, let's call it class name equals, using curly brackets, styles.canvas. Save that. So now we've defined the class name. In this instance, we can now go directly into the background.module.css file. And what we can do now is we can actually start to manipulate that canvas. So using a .canvas, since it's a class name, we want to set the position to absolute so we can move it freely. We want to set the top to something like 0. Let's set the width to 100%. Same goes with the height. This gives us the ability to make sure that the actual background spans the entire viewport, like so. In addition, we also want to give it a Z index of 1 so we know that it's at a layer of level 1. And finally, in order to create this cropped effect, I've gone ahead and already defined this style. So what we want to use is something called the clip path. Define it as a polygon and using these properties here. We save that. We have now completed the background component, which was quite easy with our styles. So once you've done all of that, the final step is to convert this into a client component. So in order to do that, just type in use client. The reason why we have this is because we're using the Spline npm package. And if we don't define this, it won't load for us correctly. So please make sure to put in use client at the top. After doing that, we also want to export it out. So just type in export default background. This way we can actually export it as our const that we've defined here. After doing that, we can now go directly into the page.tsx file. From here, we want to import that new component that we just made. And we want to target the components folder, background folder, and the background.tsx file. Save that. And let's just place it within here. So let's import it directly into here. I'm going to save that. And to make sure it's working perfectly, I'm going to go back into here. And there you go. We can now start to see that background animation starting to appear. And that's starting to look really, really cool. What I might actually do is to start manipulating this a few times. And if we go back into it, we can now start to see that animation appearing, and that's starting to look really, really cool. Fantastic. So what I'm going to do now, just so, and because I know it's working, I'm going to just delete all of this. I'm going to save this. We should have a blank screen. We sure do. And just for the time being, I'm going to go back into our page.module.css file, and I'm going to set the height to something like, I don't know, 100 vertical height, just for the time being. And if we go back into here and refresh the page, we now have our loaded animation that is almost identical to Stripes, and that's looking fantastic. In order to make this responsive, as you can see, if we actually convert this to a mobile size, if we inspect the page, you'll notice the angle changes a bit. So if I go into here, it becomes this weird looking angle. So in order to fix this, I've gone ahead and defined some media queries so that it stays roughly the same angle at all times. So I'm just going to quickly jump into VScode, and I'm going to copy these lines of code that I did in my spare time. So these are defining the maximum width, and each time it goes outside of these regions, it changes the values. So go ahead and copy this into your own work, and this way it just helps to make it responsive. So if we go back into here, if we were to change it, I don't know, to a mobile screen size, it should stay roughly the same angle, which it does. Same goes with a tablet view, a laptop view, and so forth. So that's starting to look really, really cool. So that is the background component build. The next step is we want to create the actual buttons themselves. So we have a button for the contact sales, the sign in, the start now, as well as the contact sales. So we're going to get right into that right now. Awesome. So the next step we want to do is to create a button folder for our component. So just call it button like so. Inside of the button folder, we're going to create two files similar to like what we did in the background component. So we're going to call it button.tsx for the structure. And then we're also going to create one called button.module.css for the styling. After doing that, you want to come into your button.tsx file, type in RAFCE, the shortcut, to create the component template. This is looking good. What we want to do is convert this into a button instead of a div. And just to make sure this is working, I'm going to go directly back into our page.tsx file. I'm also going to comment out the background. I'm going to import our button that we just created. And inside of here, I'm going to import this directly into here. So if I save that, and if I go, just add a space there, I'm just going to go in the file to make sure that's looking all right. Yeah, that's starting to look really good. As you can see, we have our button here. I'll just zoom in so it's easy for you guys to see. Fantastic. So once that's working, we can now go back into our button.tsx file. And there's a few things we want to do from here. Firstly, we want to import the styles connected to button.module.css. We also want to import image from next/image. This extension allows us to use images with our Next.js application. In addition to this, we want to import the arrow SVG file. Again, this can be found in the description below on my GitHub repository, so make sure to check that out. And it's inside the public folder underneath images, and arrow.svg is the file name. After doing that, what we can do now is inside of our button here, I'm going to import our image, give it an alt text of something like arrow, give it a class name called styles.arrow, just so it's connected to styles. And we're also going to give it a source name of arrow that we defined up here. Let's save that and close that off. So hopefully that works. So if we go back into our server, you should now see the arrow. You probably can't see it too well, but it's now there, which means it's working. Fantastic. So once you've got the basic structure up, the next step is we're going to start styling the 4 different button types, like what I showed before. So we have 2 black versions and we have 2 white versions. So we're going to be working with those. So what we want to do here is let's start off with, let's go with black button with a background to start off with. So what we can do here is inside of our button.tsx file, give it a class name called styles.button, black button with background. And what we can do here is if we go directly into our button.module file here, paste that in, make it a class like so with the dot at the start. And then on here, what we want to do is we want to set the following properties. So for our padding, we want to give it a 0.1875 rem for the top and bottom, 0.75 rem for the left and right. We also want to give it a font size of 0.875 rem. We also want to give it a font weight of 600. We also want to set the font style to normal. We also want to set the line height to something like 1.5 rem. We also want to set the background color to transparent. We also want to set the border radius to something like 10 rem. We also want to set the border again to transparent, just so we don't have a border shown in the button. In addition, we want to give it a cursor of pointer. We also want to set the color of the text to white. And finally, let's set the background color. Since we're starting with a black background with the background, let's change this to black, like so. So hopefully if this works correctly, I'm just going to make sure the class name's correct. Yep, that looks good. Fantastic. If we go back into our server, we should have our very first button. That's looking great. The spacing between the arrow and the text isn't too good, so I'm going to quickly fix that up right now. Since I defined the class name of the arrow image to arrow, I'm just going to quickly copy this, go back into our button.module.css file, and with our arrow, let's give it some margin. So let's give it some margin of 0.5 rem to the left. Let's give it a transform or something like, I don't know. Let's set the default as being 0 rem, just so that's its original position. And let's give it a transition so we have a smooth effect when we do the hover. Okay, cool. Save that. And just to make sure that works properly, I've gone ahead and picked out the black button with background whilst hovering. covering the arrow, and we've set the transform of translate x to 0.1875 rem, so it's going to move slightly to the right, and set the transition to the exact same up here. I'm going to save this, and for our very first button design, let's see how that looks. There's much more spacing in there, and if we actually hover over it, you have this nice hover effect, and that's starting to look really cool. Great. So that's the first design. The next one we have is one with no background, so let's do that right now. So if we go back into here, just change the width to no background. And if we go into here, what we can actually do is we can actually, just going to drag the arrow up here, put it on top of here, and I'm literally just going to copy these two divs, and instead of width, just change it to no. Same thing down here, no. And the background color, I'm going to change it to transparent. So hopefully if we go back into the file, and if I've defined it to have no background, which I have here, we should now have a black image. Unfortunately, it's not appearing. That's because the text is white. So make sure to change this to also black, just so I can see the actual white text itself. I'm going to go directly into the page.module.css file, and just for this part of the video, I'm going to give it a background color of something like gray, and I'm just going to change this to a slightly lighter color. So now if we go back into here, we should have this gray background. So now we can see the visibility of the buttons. So what I'm going to do now is go back into our button.tsx file, and I'm going to change the black to a white value, and I'm going to change this to with background. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to grab these two, copy these down, change this to white with background. Do the same down here. So white with background. And for the background color, I've actually defined it inside of my Figma prototype. So I'm just going to click on here just so I can get the right properties for it. And the color codes here, you can copy this in your very own time. I'm just going to paste that directly into here. And hopefully that works. Oh no, wrong one. That's the color. The background color is what we want. And if we change this to white, so hashtag FFF for the text, and just to make sure we've defined that as white button with background. Yep. So if we go into our file, we should now have a white background. Maybe if I refresh this, oh yeah, there we go. So we have our other design with the white background. That's starting to look really good. And for the final button design that we have one with no background as shown here. So what we can do now is we can just change this to have no background. So I'm just going to add this in as our new style. Go back into the button.module.css file here. Copy these two like so. We're going to change this to no background. And all we have to do is just change the background color to transparent. Awesome. So what we've done is we've defined all of our styles, and we can actually swap them between different types. So for instance, in this case, no background. If we go into here, it has no background. If we were to go out and manipulate this to have with background, and if we go back into here, it now has a background. But in order for this to work within our page.tsx file, we're going to have to use props, and I'm going to run you through exactly how we're going to do that right now. Since I'm using TypeScript, we want to define two different props. The first one is going to be what our text is going to be, and our second one is going to be the type of button, which determines the class name as shown here. So let's do that right now. What we want to do underneath import arrow, we want to type in the following: interface button props. So this determines what props we're going to be using. So the first one is going to be called text, and this will be a type of string. The second one we're going to put in is type, and this is a conditional statement depending on what type of class name this is. So what we want to type in is the following: white button with background. And we want to copy this down, change this to no background, do the exact same thing, change this width, change the white to black, So we're essentially defining our styles here based on the class name here. And we're going to change this width to no. And there we go. We've defined our button props within the interface. After doing that, we then want to convert this const into a React functional component. So in order to do that, just add in a colon, type in react.fc, and we want to type in button props, which is the name that we defined up here. And inside of the parentheses, we want to add in curly brackets and type in the following text, which we defined here, and also type that we added right here. So after doing that, the next thing we're going to do, rather than doing a really long conditional statement, I want to use a switch statement. It's much more efficient, and we can determine exactly what type of button to be used in the page.tsx file. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we want to set a variable. So let's set the following. Let button style equals blank. So this will determine what this value is. So what we can actually do is grab this this value that we created here and just put it directly into here. Just make sure that's removed. After doing that, we now want to create a switch statement. So with our switch, we're going to create a parentheses, and within here, we want to define the type value here with the following conditions. So for our first case, we want to set the white button with background. And if our prop is set to this, then what we want to do is set our button style to the following: styles.white button with background. We want to add in a break. After doing so, we want to copy this exact same thing, paste it in here. I'm going to bring this down, change this to no background, change the value here to no background, copy the exact same thing like so. We're going to change this down to with background, change this to black button, and we want to set this to black and with. And the final case statement we want to add in is having no background for a black button. So let's add that in right now. Fantastic. Once you've defined that, what happens now is whatever value we put inside of our prop here, these button styles will be determined through here. And that way we can actually determine what type of button style we want to use inside of the page.tsx file. So after defining your switch statement, the next step we want to do is, instead of having button here, we want to allow for the user to put in whatever text they want within the page.tsx file so that the button appears to however they want it to appear. And we want to use curly brackets and put in text. To make sure this is working properly, what we can do now is go into our page.tsx file. And what I've done is I've gone ahead and put in our type. In this case, I've put in the type of black button with background. And I've also defined our text value here as this is a button test. So I'm going to save this. And if we go back into our file here, we can now see that the button has been updated. And a great thing about this is if we were to go back into our VScode here, go back into our button, and let's say, for instance, hey, I want to use this style here, the white button with white background. So in order for us to use that, if we go into white button with background, like this one here, and if we go into our page.tsx file, change the type to white button with background. If we save that, we should now have this type of button here. In this case, if we open up the server, we now have that button. So now it's completely customizable and we can choose whatever text we want. So now, once we've completed the button component, the next step of the video is actually to go in and to create the navbar, which I'm going to do right now. What we're going to do now is create a new component and we're going to call it navbar, like so. Inside navbar, we can create the two files, so navbar.tsx, and we're also going to create another one called navbar.module.css, like so. Inside of navbar.tsx, we're going to type in RAFCE, which will create the template for us. From here, what we're going to do is we're going to change this div to a nav. Same goes with this, and we also want to delete this navbar in the center here. After doing that, what you want to do is come over to underneath import React from React, and we want to import the following. So the first thing, if you notice in our design, we have an image of the logo for Stripe. So we're going to import that in right now. So what you can do is type in import logo from, I'm going to target the public folder. Underneath the public folder, we're going to pick out the logo.svg. Again, this can be found in the GitHub repository in the link below, so make sure to check it out. After doing that, we also want to import the image component or extension rather from next/image. This way it allows us to bring in images using Next.js. Another one we also want to bring in as an extension is something called link. So this allows us to bring in A tags or A divs into a Next.js application. And we also want to import our styles that we created. So let's target those styles like so. After doing that, we also want to import the button component that we just created. After doing that, the next step is we want to start building out the actual navbar. So for the nav, we want to give it a class name called styles.nav. And then underneath here, what we want to do is define a UL tag, and we want to give it a class name called styles.ul. Underneath here, we also want to give it a list item. So the very first list item is our logo here. And what we're going to do is give it a class name called styles.logo. Underneath here, we want to bring in that image extension that we added in with Next.js. And underneath here, we want to give it an alt text and call it logo. And we also want to define the source and pick out the logo like so. Fantastic. After doing that, we want to create a second one and give it a class name called styles.li. And this will be all of our list items directed out here. So let's add that in right now. And underneath here, we want to give it a link with the href value of / with a class name called styles.a, like so. Fantastic. Underneath here, I'm going to add in products as shown in the actual design itself. And what I'll do is I'll repeat this as many times until I get to the very end, being pricing. So I'm going to do that right now. Fantastic. So once you've copied all of that, the next part is to actually add in our buttons. So what we can do now is close up the unordered list item that we created. And underneath here, we want to create a new div with the class name of buttons. And inside of here, this is where we can start importing button component that we just created. And inside of here for the text, let's give it whatever the design has. So if we go into the design, it says contact sales. I'm going to copy this, paste it directly into here. The type, it appears to be a white button with no background. So I'm just going to quickly go back into here and pick out that style. So white button with no background. Chuck that into here. And I'm going to copy that. Use sign in. Quickly put in sign in here. And I'm just going to delete this and white button with background. Save that. So now we've defined our unordered list as well as our button style here. And what we can do now is if we go into our page.tsx file here, I'm going to quickly import Navbar just to make sure we can actually see it. So I'm just going to quickly component /navbar/navbar, and I'm going to bring it underneath here like so. Save that. And hopefully if we open up our design, refresh the page, as we can see, the background image is above. So in order to fix this, what we can do is if we go back into VScode, go back into our background component, into our background.module.css file. Instead of setting the Z index to 1, we can change this to -1, so it's behind. And if we go into here, there we go. We now have our navbar items, which are displaying up here, and that looks really, really cool. So what we'll do now is we'll start to style it so that it starts to mimic and replicate what is shown in the prototype here. So let's do that right now. So with our navbar.module.css file here, what I'm going to do is pick out our nav item here. I'm going to give it a padding value of 1.25 rem for the top and bottom. And for the left and right, let's give it something like 15 vertical width so it's responsive. Let's set the display of flex. Let's set the justify content to space between. Let's also set the align items to center. let's set the position to relative, and we want to set the Z index to 1, so it's above the background animation component that we created. After doing that, we then want to target the unordered list, and you may notice at this stage it is in a column format. We want to make sure it's in a row format. So in order to fix that, what we can do now is set the display of this to flex, align items to center, justify content to flex start. We also want to set this list style to none. We want to set the margin to 0. We want to set the padding as well to 0. And after doing that, we then want to target each individual allied list item, so .li. And we want to set the padding left value of 2.4375 rems, so they're pushed out from one another. And after doing that, what I want to do now is to target the actual A tags. And for the color, just give it something like hashtag FFF. Save us time defining what these styles are. I'm just going to go directly into our stripe item here and go up here. And this defines all the styles for the A tag. So I'm just going to copy all of this right here. Copy that and paste it into here. And I'm just going to remove the font family. So now if we go directly back into here, we now have our navbar, and that's starting to look really, really cool. I just realized the font weight looks a bit strange here. So I'm going to quickly fix that up and get rid of that. And if we go back into it, that should hopefully fix it. Yep, that looks a lot better. So if we now inspect the page, you will now see that it's not responsive. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and during my spare time, I have actually defined some responsive styles for us. So what I'll do is I've defined some media queries. So anything less than 1,199 pixels, we're going to change the padding to this value here. Same thing goes with anything less than 899 pixels. We're going to get rid of the A tags completely. So if we save this and if we go directly back into the design, let it load. There we go. If we inspect the page, and now you'll notice if we drag this out, it is now responsive. So even if we're in mobile view, we can now see it as a responsive design. If we go into our laptop view, this is what the navbar looks like. And the great thing is the buttons are working perfectly and we have this fantastic animation, and that's starting to look really, really cool. So the next part of the video, and for our second last component, we're very close to the end. We're going to be creating this title effect. What we're going to do is go back into our components folder. We're going to create a new component. We're going to call it title blend. Inside of title blend, we're going to create two files. Again, title blend.tsx. And we're also going to add in another one called title blend.module.css. Inside of title blend, what we want to do is type in IFCE, and we want to get rid of this. After doing so, we also want to import our styles from our title blender module.css styles that we created just here. And from here, what we can do now for the div, we're going to give it a class name and call it styles.title. And inside of styles.title, we're also going to create a second div called title blend. So I'm going to do that right now. So the class name, let's call it styles.title. Inside of styles.title, we're going to create three H1 tags. So the first one is going to be financial. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it into here. Copy this twice more underneath. Change this to infrastructure. And for the final one, it will be called for the internet. Save that. And just to make sure that this is working, I'm just going to go into our page.tsx file here. I'm going to import the title blend from our components /title blend. And if I save that, put this underneath here, we will see that. If not, it's probably underneath the main div. Just to make sure this is working, I'm going to go directly into here. There it is. It is now appearing, and that's starting to look quite nice. Might bring this out a little bit more. Fantastic. So once we've done that, the next step is we want to start actually styling it. So let's do that right now. Jump back into VScode. Let's jump back into the title blend.module.css file. And from here, what we can actually do is target the .title class name. This time I'm going to set the position to absolute. Set the Z index to 2, so it's above the background component. You also want to give a top value of something like 10 rem, so it's 10 rem from the top. We also want to give it a left value of 15 vertical width, so it mimics what's been done in the navbar. We also want to give it a width with the following calculation, so 100 vertical width minus 15 vertical width. After doing so, we also want to give it a mixed blend mode of color burn. This gives it that nice blend effect to it. After doing that, we then want to define our title blend. We're going to give it a position of absolute and give it a Z index of 0, so it's underneath. And once we've done that, if we go back into here, for some reason it's in the center. There's a reason why this happened. So if I go back into our VScode here, in the title blend, rather than calling this title, we want to call it title blend. So now the CSS is being impacted here. And if we go back into here, it should now be in the direction that we want. And as you can see, we have this amazing overlay effect, and that looks really, really cool. So if we zoom in even a bit more, this is what it's starting to look like, and that just looks fantastic. To make this responsive, again, I've gone ahead and during my spare time, I have created a media query for this. So once the width gets above a certain amount, in this case 1199 pixels, we want it to be dropped down to 5 vertical width to the left, so it mimics what is shown in the navbar. So if I go back into here, inspect the page, and if we drag this out, we now have this mimicked effect, and that's looking really cool. So the final part of this video, if we go back into our Figma design, we have our contents component, which consists of the description, some buttons, as well as the hero image to the right here. So let's go ahead and create this right now. So what I'm going to do is underneath components, I'm going to create a new folder. In fact, I'm just going to get rid of all of these files here, just so it's easier to read. Underneath components, I'm going to create a new one, and we're going to call it contents. Underneath contents, we're going to create the 2 files, so contents.tsx, and we're also going to create another one called contents.module.css. And underneath here, what we're going to do now is we're going to go into contents.tsx using that same shortcut. We're going to create this template. Underneath import React from React, we're going to import our image. So image from next/image, the extension, just so we can use images with Next.js. We're also going to import some styles from the style sheet that I just created. We're also going to import the hero image from the public folder. Again, this can be found on the GitHub repository in the link below. So I'm going to target the hero image. After doing that, I'm also going to import our button component from button, and target the button.tsx file. After doing that, I'm going to define a class name of styles.contents within the div. I'm going to get rid of this. Underneath here, we're going to create a new div with a class name called styles.description. And underneath here, we're going to create a p tag with the following class name of styles.p to represent p tag. And underneath here, I'm just going to copy and paste the placeholder here, and I'm going to paste it directly into here, like so. After doing that, the next part is the buttons themselves. So if we go underneath this div here for the description, we're going to have another one called buttons. So I'm just going to add that in right now. And make sure that this is set to styles.buttons, like so. Underneath the styles.buttons container, we're going to import the 2 button components that we recently created. So button, and we're going to give it a text called start now. So I'm just going to add that in here. And the type is, so if I go back into the button container here, it's going to be a black button with a background. So I'm just going to copy this style here, go back into our contents, paste it in there. And we're going to close that div up like so. After doing that, we then want to copy the exact same thing, paste it underneath here. Instead of start now, it's contact sales. And we want to make sure there's no background to it like so. Fantastic. So once you've defined the contents, which includes the description and your buttons here, the final part is to actually add in the hero image, which is this part here. So we'll do that right now. In fact, I'm going to drag this buttons here underneath the P tag so that the description is the first part of the display system. And underneath description, we're going to create a new one called image. And the image is going to contain alt text of hero image. And we're also going to give it a class name defined as styles.heroImage. And we are also going to define the source itself with the following as hero image. And we're going to also close that up like so. So now what we have is we have our contents, which contains these two items here. Inside of our description container, we have our P tag as well as some buttons, which are contained within inside here. And in addition to our description, we also have our hero image will be located on this part of the page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go directly into the CSS and start to style it so it looks exactly like this right now. So I'm going to jump into contents.modules.css for the actual contents themselves. I'm going to define the following. So for the padding, I'm going to make sure there's a top value of 0, right 0, bottom 0, and for the left vertical width, so it mimics the navbar and also the title that we just created. I'm going to make sure that this time it's set to a display of grid, so we make sure that the content is on the left and then the image is on the right. And then we want to define the template to have 2 columns, so one fraction like so. We also want to give it 1 row. So for the rows, we're going to set that to 1 fraction. For the align items, we want to make sure this is set to flex end, like so. And then for the position, set it to relative, and then also defining the Z indexes. Let's give it 2, so it's above the background component. After doing this, we then want to mimic and manipulate the actual description component in here. So what we're going to do is pick out that description, and inside description, let's just give it a padding of, I don't know, 0 for the top, 0 for the right, and 10 rem for the bottom, 0 for the left. After that, with the P tag, I'm going to give it a padding and give it 003.12 rem and 0. And again, we'll give it a fixed width of something like 30 rem. So now if we go into our page.tsx file, just to make sure this is working well, we are going to bring in the contents component that we just created. And let's grab that right now. So contents like so. Underneath the title blend, we're going to put in our contents. So now that we have all of our components, let's see how this is starting to look. So as you can see, the image is too close to the text. So in order to fix this, what we can actually do is if we go back into our content.module.css, instead of setting the 1 fraction values here, you can actually set it to percentages instead. So I'm going to do that right now. Let's set it to something like, I don't know, 50%. And also give it another 50%. We save that. That should hopefully solve the problem. It does in this instance. And that's starting to look really, really cool. As you can see, we have our overlay effect. We have the image to our right here. And then we also have our buttons underneath here. And that's starting to look quite cool. You may notice as I zoom in and out, the actual size of the video background stays the exact same. So in order to change this, what we can do is if we go back into our VScode, we go into our page.module.css file. Instead of having this as 100 vertical height, let's change it back to 100%. And if we go back into here, that should hopefully fix it. Yes, it does. And if we fix this up, it's starting to look really, really good. And no matter how much we zoom, that position of the background image stays the exact same. It doesn't actually move. So that's starting to look really, really cool. Fantastic. You may notice again, if I inspect the page, it's not responsive at this stage. The only thing that's responsive is the title and the navbar. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and during my spare time, I've gone ahead and defined some media queries. So when the maximum width gets to 1199 pixels, I've changed the padding so it mimics what's shown in the navbar and the title being 5 vertical width. I've also defined the description to have a different value as well as the p tag and make it order as opposed to a fixed value. And then anything underneath 599 pixels, I've changed it so that the grid template columns are now set to 100%, so it's vertical. I've slightly adjusted the padding so it works in mobile view quite well. Same goes with the description, and also with the hero image, I've decided to not display it just because it opens up and makes it easier to read for the user. So if we go ahead, have a look at how this is looking, this looks fantastic. If we inspect the page with all those changes in, and if you actually zoom in, as you can see, it's completely responsive, and that looks absolutely amazing. So what we've done is we've created a completely functional working Stripe hero recreation that is completely responsive as well, no matter what screen type you're in, if that's in desktop or mobile. And as you can see, we have these awesome animation effects occurring with these really cool overlay transitions. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a really long one, but if you did stick around, good on you, because this is like a really tough project to work on. But again, I hope you guys really enjoyed this. If you'd like to see more, make sure to check out my other playlists in the description below. I do create heaps of other tutorials if you want to learn more about front-end development or even improving on your UI design skills. Definitely go check it out. And also please make sure to subscribe and hit on the bell notification so anytime I upload a new video, you guys get notified immediately. And if you did learn something, let me know. I'd be more than welcome to help you guys out. And in the meantime, I will catch you all in the next one. See you later.